that's where we wanted to go specifically, but you can go anywhere you want to go. Has anybody listened to the Daft Punk Random Access Memories from a couple years ago? Very monumental record for a lot of reasons. We were talking about it, Ian Shepherd and us at dinner, even for the loudness war. It's just not really typical modern record, yet it was so palatable, which is great. But it's been called, that album has been called, quote, one of the best engineered records in many years, and, quote, arguably the best sounding record in the 21st century.
I didn't know that one.
Just saying what other people have said. Just so people know, it won Grammy for Album of the Year. It won Grammy for Best Engineered Album of the Year, courtesy of this guy. And then Get Lucky, the single, got Record of the Year the same year. So we're honored and privileged to have you, Mick. You're the man most responsible for the sonics of Random Access Memories, as you both recorded and mixed the record. So we just want to thank you. Put our hands together for Mick for spending time with you here. And I know there's a lot of people that made that record happen, and I know that it was a very collaborative effort and just an excellent example of a masterpiece of people coming together and doing what they do best. But we'll talk about what you did on it, and a little bit about Mick, just so you don't go under the radar. I mean, Mick has been in the business forever. He's mixed multiple #1 hits. I think you have 11 and counting Grammys, which is more than one, which is incredible. There's a whole other one in front of that one. He's worked with Earth, Wind & Fire, Eric Clapton, Prince, Mariah Carey, Boyz II Men, all the boy bands that we heard in like Backstreet Boys, NSYNC, Britney Spears, Christina Aguilera, and Snoop Dogg. I love how Snoop Dogg is in there as well. So when you have Eric Clapton, Earth, Wind & Fire, and Snoop Dogg all in one list, it's really, really incredible. You've done so much of the pop music that we've heard over the last 20 years, but also it's so cool that the Daft Punk guys brought you in on this record because of your past experience with a lot of 60s and 70s music and just the naturalism, and you wanted to focus on instrumentalism.
Not quite 60s, I'm not that old.
Your influence is taking you back, and that's why they reached out to you. But I want to talk about that record in particular, and one thing I saw you talk about, and I loved it, and I want to start here, is you've said before that you didn't want this album to sound EQ'd, that you wanted it to sound as natural as possible. Can you explain what you mean by that, and maybe walk through how that vision of wanting to sound natural really played out in the recording phase?
Well, we had a meeting with the guys, with Tomas and Gila before the project, and they said that they wanted it to be a modern representation of what 70s and 80s albums, where they played me some disco albums, but they also played me some Fleetwood Mac stuff. A lot of classic records from the late 70s and through the early 80s. And the thing about most of that, it was all very warm. It was, I'm sure it was EQ'd, but it didn't sound it. Very organic sounding. So that's what we were going for in that recording. And what we did is try to use a minimum of EQ to get by. And experiment with different microphones, different mic placements when doing the tracking sessions. And it was recorded digitally, recorded on Pro Tools, but through an analog console and a lot of outboard analog preamps, compressors, EQs. And we tried to get it sounding pretty close to what was going to end up sounding like when the tracks were down. And so the overdubs would fit with what was there when they did a lot of the overdubs. That there was always a good example sonically of what was going on. And when we mixed it, we didn't use a drastic amount of EQ. It was little shelving on the top end, and not a lot of compression. We didn't mix with any limiting. A little bit of bus compression, a little bit moderate amount of EQ. Of course, there's some EQ on individual channels to make things work together, because once everything's all put together, you've got to sort of notch in and fit in the picture where things are going to go. So I wouldn't say we didn't use EQ, but we try to keep it minimal so it didn't sound filtered, and except for the electronics on the album, which was supposed to sound like that.
So can you walk us, like, take the drums, for example, because the drums, they needed to sound like the 70s, they needed to sound like disco drums, but they needed to sound modern at the same time, which is a really hard thing to do. Can you talk about how maybe choosing mics and choosing preamps and sculpting the sound without an EQ, what did that look like tracking day?
Well, there was some EQ, but not drastic amount, as I was saying. We ended up using 4 mics on the kick drum. We used a 421, and we used a Sony C500, which is an old condenser mic they don't make anymore, but it handled an incredible amount of sound pressure and had a very, very extended top end. So that gave us sort of the click of the beater and the definition. Well, the low-mid punch was the 421, and then there was a 47 fat outside for the way to develop it too, and then also one of those drum subs with that Yamaha speaker, which we didn't really use much of, but was recorded anyways. And then moved all the tracks in phase in Pro Tools, where the microphones, like the 47 was in the foot and a half behind the other ones. So everything was moved to just lock in phase, and just all on separate tracks. So the mixing process could really balance between them, and rather than turning up the high end if we needed a little more beater, turn up the C500. Rather than boosting the low end of EQ if we needed a little more real subs from the kick, bring up the 47 fat. It was more of that kind of thing. Snare was pretty standard, SM57 on top. I think we used a 451 on the bottom. Of course you do have to always EQ the snare top mic, but just try to not do it. Trying to position mics that the phase was good and that didn't have to use a lot of sharp Q EQs and make things sound too filtered, which is mostly gentle shells and things what we used.
And I mean, you're just mixing and match preamps as well. I mean, I know you had a unique experience where they gave you a lot of time
to just of time, and they brought more gear, and they kept any piece of gear we wanted. It was most fun I've had in the session. I think we probably had Vintage King's entire showroom in there. But yeah, different preamps. We used API 312s for the kick and snare. I've always liked those nice punchy sounding preamps. We used the console preamps we used was Neve 88R for the toms, and I think we used Neve 1073s on the overheads.
Okay, what mics did you use on the overheads?
Let me see. Well, I think it was Sheps CM5Us.
Okay. I mean, did you use any room mics on the drums? Because I know you weren't going for a really
see, here's the thing. In that album, parts of it are very roomy. And since the album was, it wasn't like, okay, we're going to do this here. It was a lot of grooves, a lot of the band playing spliced together. A lot of songs came out of other songs that were, so it wasn't arranged as a series of songs. It was a series of parts. So what we ended up doing for the drum sound and most of the sound tracking was we were in Conway Studio C, which is a fairly live room, a big room, but we baffled the drums off fairly tightly and also had room mics. So the close mics were very close, but we did have some room mics, except for there was a couple of parts where, this has definitely got to be roomy, and we didn't have the drums go vote off as much. But for the most part, we tried to leave enough flexibility to get what we needed.
You guys went as far, correct me if I'm wrong, you said you tracked to Pro Tools, but you also tracked to tape and to both 15 IPs and 30 IPs, right?
Well, tracking was Pro Tools at 96K, and also on some songs we tracked to Studer AA27, running at 15 IPs with Dolby SR.
Okay.
And that machine was it was actually just running recording and running in repro. There was 2 SR racks there and recording to 24 other tracks on Pro Tools. And then after we got the tape, we just moved the tracks that came off the repro head that was a little later in with the digital tracks. And those guys went through and they figured out they decided on which sound they'd like for each song. So there's songs that are actually a combination of what's coming off the analog tape and what's coming off of Pro Tools.
That's what I'm getting at. That's how I'm saying it. So you're saying that they, even on one song could have parts of that song, the tape version, and parts the digital Pro Tools version.
Yeah.
And
I mean, the difference is subtle.
Oh yeah, it is. So can you explain, the way you hear it, why in one moment you would choose the Pro Tools version because of the way it sounds versus the tape version? Just maybe describe what you would be hearing. Or is there, what track maybe was like you picked the Pro Tools version because? sounded?
Well, actually, I wasn't the one who picked.
Sure, but do you know? Like, were you letting them know? Like,
well, I could tell once we mixed because I knew where could hear it then. But when those guys when they took everything back to Paris and spent months and months editing the album. And then brought it to me when it's in a final form to mix it. Even then, that wasn't quite a final form. They were in another room with another Pro Tools system, listening to what I was doing in the mix in there, and they would work on parts and edits and stuff and send it to me while we're mixing, so it was collaborative through the whole process.
Are they wearing their robot helmets while they're doing? Like, I picture them editing on Pro Tools, a massive motorcycle helmet. No, okay. But like, so like the I'm assuming like the digital version might have maybe a little bit more top end on some songs.
Actually, little higher transients, peaks weren't compressed. We would try, of course, not to clip the digital signal, and the analog, we'd let it saturate a little bit.
Yeah.
So I mean, it wasn't as it was punchy, but it didn't have quite the transient detail that the digital did. But it did sound a little smoother and warmer. And the bottom end was really big because our analog 15 nips has got that head bump way down, like 30 to 50 hertz, and it doesn't quite sound like EQ in there, but it's a really nice fat bottom end. So I mean, that was used in some cases.
I mean, you touched on this a little bit, but with all the time spent on the front end on recording, choosing mics, blending mics, choosing preamps, trying to get the sound right, did you find that when you came time to mix, since you had spent so much time on the front end, had so much control, had so many options, did it make mixing for you pretty straightforward, and you had exactly what you needed, or?
Yeah, pretty much. Because I knew what most of the tracks were and most of the overdubs that I worked on, so it was nice to just put it together easily. Then there was a lot of stuff to discover that they did afterwards.
Sure.
But yeah, mixing wasn't a hard process on that album. It was sort of a long process because it was done entirely on an analog console, entirely with analog outboard gear. So a mix would stay up for days, even if it was a fairly easy mix, until they were 100% sure. But we never did a recall on that album. That's a luxury. And a lot of times, on a lot of songs, I would get the mix in a day, and then they decide they wanted to, say, hey, take a day off. We want to work on some parts and fix this, and then come back. So they booked the whole summer for mixing. We spent the whole summer of 2012 mixing, but it wasn't really intense, like in the studio every day, working tons of hours. It was
you going for walks on the beach, and
they
were editing with their masks on. No, and the whole album. How many years total from conception? 4 or 5 year process, or?
I think there was 3 years before I was involved.
Wow.
Of them, getting ideas and songs together, and tracking was a few. I think it was 2 or 3 different sessions of a couple of weeks each, or a week each, and then they spent months and months of editing and overdubbing. Then I worked on some overdub sessions that came out again for a couple of weeks at a time. A lot of the overdubs, like a lot of the vocals and guitar overdubs, were done in other studios so they could do with the artists. I didn't have anything to do with those, so those were nice surprises when I got them to mix. Basically, what I did on the album is did all the basic tracks, a lot of quite a few overdubs, and the orchestra tracks. We did that at Capitol, and then mixed it.
That's awesome. I mean, for the people here, and for people like me, and I know you're doing a lot in the box with plugins generally. I know this project they were very specific and adamant. They wanted to use just hardware.
Yeah.
But what advice would you give to a home studio owner, someone who's working out of a home studio? They're all in the box. Not only that, but really they don't have a complete long mic locker. They don't have multiple preamps to swap in and out. They don't have multiple drum kits to swap in and out. They don't have all the options that maybe you guys had on this record. What advice could you give someone? How can they maximize maybe their limited setup to still create and mimic kind of the mindset of what you were trying to do with Random Access Memories, which is create the best sound on tracking day so you don't have to do a lot of extreme stuff in the mix phase? What advice would you give that person?
Well, I would say to have a few varied types of microphones, some good small diaphragm condensers, some good large diaphragm condensers, some dynamics, and you can get decent microphones that aren't too expensive these days. Most, I would say, have a couple preamps that are transformerless and nice fast electronics for things you want really accurate, and then have some transformer type preamps, because transformers are just really fat in the low end. And I'm not saying they all do, and I really don't know which ones are great in the lower price range, but I know there are some. So I mean, there's a lot of work to find that out. And then I think the most important thing of anything is the instruments are sounding good, and the microphones are in a good position, and not picking up leakage that has a lot of that. At fairly short distances from one mic to the other, to where there's phase problems, and comb filtering because of phase problems. So it's watching out for mic position. Using cardioid mics to reject something from another drum or another instrument. I've heard people get great recordings using only SM57s.
Yeah.
Remember a lot of Giorgio Moroder stuff that Jürgen Kappers did, like Donna Summer records and stuff. All 57s, pretty much.
No, that's all. Would you say your goal? You had unlimited gear and budget, but what you were trying to do, like the concept behind it, was experimenting with sounds and finding what gave you the best sound for what you were looking for, instead of just saying, "This, I'm going to go for the first microphone with the first placement and call it a day." Like you took the time, right?
It wasn't a tremendous amount of time doing that, because I've been doing this for a long time, enough time to go, okay, for this sound, this is going to give me that. So there wasn't a lot of changing microphones after we, after we decided on microphones. Couple times we changed things, but it was mostly experimenting with the position. And also we had great musicians. JR on drums, and Omar Hakim on drums, Nathan East on bass. So it wasn't, these guys just sound great in the room, so it's really not a hell of a lot.
So just work with superstars. That's right. That's great. Before we get to everyone's questions here, I've polled my entire email list who couldn't be here, what they could ask you. I got hundreds of responses back that people actually wanted to ask you questions. I tried to read them and find out what were some of the common denominators, and two questions jumped out that seemed like a lot of people had the same. One was, how on that record, how did you get such perfect clarity in all the instruments, while at the same time having a massive the bottom end on that record is so huge and so fat, and yet it doesn't take over the rest of the mix? So how do you have the big low end and also plenty of clarity everywhere else in the mix? People were like stumped about that.
Well, when the low end is that big, you want to make sure that you don't have interference from other instruments that go anywhere close to the fundamental of that. A lot of the other instruments in that are fairly, a lot of the overdubs are thinned out a little bit, so it doesn't conflict with the low end. Things are nicely in tune, so there'll be frequencies against stuff, and it's mainly in mixing just carving out so there's not conflicts in one frequency range. Like sometimes we'd use high pass filters, gentle ones though, not like sharp cutoff or anything, but to roll off the bottom end of, say, keyboard or guitar or vocal, keep it out of the range of the bass and kick, and also making sure that things that would resonate with that, like the toms and stuff, were gone through and edited, that a lot of the ring was between hits or taken out. I don't believe in just cutting it out and leaving just the toms and a huge bit of cymbal leakage then cut off. I usually cut the tom fills, and then actually I did a couple times of this album, but my usual way of dealing with tom tracks is just clip gain them down, say -10, -12, and then cut the fills, and just put those back up to 0 and do crossfades. So you have leakage, but you don't have all the ringing and stuff.
So it's just quiet. It's still natural, but it's just quieter.
Yeah,
that makes sense. So, anything in particular you're doing? They just seem to be. They want to know, how do you get such clarity in a song that's that big? It feels like a dance song, yet it's just not crunched together. It just still has so much openness in it, and
well, it's not compressed. Remember, we didn't go for a lot of volume on that record,
right?
And that helps that quite a bit. Where the peaks are still peaks, not crunching everything. That the peak to average ratio is just a couple dB, and then bringing everything up. The compression on that is sort of gentle. It's only a couple dB, maybe 4 at the most, and it's not an extremely fast attack, so it's letting transients through. It's good arrangements, and not trying to brag, but it's mixing to keep things, to keep everything articulate. It's not.
Yeah. No, I love it. And the second question they had, and this was asked of Bob and Dylan, I think, a minute ago, but how do you personally know when a mix is finished? And how to stop tinkering? How do you know when to not, like as Mixer Man said, don't go past the mix?
Yeah, well, I totally do. Just exactly what Bob said. If I can listen to it a couple times without cringing or reaching for something, then I think it's done, and then I turn it off, and I turn it in, and in most cases, maybe 4 recalls later, it's done.
There's no way they make Mick recall anything.
Not in the Daft Punk. We do that. But no, because usually I work alone at home. So I get it where I like it, send it in, and get some recall notes. Do that sometimes the second time. It's usually not. I usually don't miss so bad that there's like things that really change the core of the mix. It's more like more like, oh, we'd like this this little part accentuated more, or it's just it's. I very seldom have to start over again. I have, a couple times, just like Bob and Dylan said, but usually it's something tweaking from what I already have.
Got it. Yeah, love it.
I just finished a really interesting album. I had tons of fun with it. Did it alone at home. Barry Gibb did a new solo album. That's amazingly good.
Barry Gibb.
Yeah, great band, and it was very well engineered. Guy John Merchant, I don't know if you know him.
Oh yeah,
did it, and his miking is impeccable. Mic choice and miking is
awesome.
Beautiful. They did the tracks in the big room at Criteria Hit Factory in Miami. Wow. Used a lot of room sound on the drums. And one thing that was really cool is he didn't EQ or compress at all. Anything. So, I mean, it was like getting microphones in off the floor to mix from. It was so much fun to work with.
That's awesome. When you mix something like that you weren't tracking on, which I know is probably a lot of what you've been doing.
Most of what
you do.
I don't track very often.
When you're starting, I'm just curious, since you know that you didn't have the control over the recording side of things, do you find it that you're always reaching for more processing than you would say on the Daft Punk record? Because
not on this record. I mean, there's there was some EQ and quite a bit of processing, but not. There's a difference between saying, okay, I've got 30 or 40 different channels of processing here. Big difference between that and they're all doing something subtle than having a few channels that you've got to crank because something's really a mess that you got to fix. This is more like just just gently nudging things, and which we did on Daft Punk also too. But it wasn't like, oh, I got to fix this to make it sound good. It sounded really good, and his rough mixes sounded good, so I could get a really good idea of the song and what they were going for before even starting.
Yeah, that's great. Let's move on to questions. I want you guys to be able to ask Mick whatever you want to ask. Right in the back, you jump first.
Hey, Mick.
Yeah.
A couple of years ago, you mentioned the DSP 8400 as a secret weapon.
Oh, the 84,000?
That's right, 84,000. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that it is in fact a game changer. What's your secret plugin of choice these days?
Well, I still use that. I use the Fab filter for you're talking about for dynamic EQ, right?
Just any secret weapon you love.
Okay, well,
what's your secret?
Just
tell us, Mick.
The secret is to use anything that works. I like the Fab Filter Pro MD, their multi-band compressor, if you're talking about something that does something similar. I just found an incredible plugin that got this email as ad from a company called Valhalla DSP. And they have this plate, Valhalla DSP plate, The plug-in's $50, and I've never heard a simulation of a plate reverb that's anywhere near close to this thing. I mean, this sounds like so close to an EMT 140, I can't believe it.
Go buy it. Valhalla guys are cool. They email. Yes, Mr. Shepard.
Hi, Mick. So I'm Ian Shepard. I've spoken a couple of things earlier today. One other thing I do is I run a thing called Dynamic Range Check, trying to make people aware of the issues of the loudness war. So this is the question I just want to say personally, thank you for making this record and allowing it to be so dynamic, because it's such a fantastic poster child for what you can do if you give a record more room to breathe. I was just curious to know whether you had any feeling when you were working on it that it was going to be a big thing, that it was something special. I mean, obviously, special in terms of the rope you were given.
Yeah, enough to hang myself, but I didn't. That was No, actually, when we finished the record, I was personally very, very happy with the way it sounded and about all that, but I was also very worried, thinking, oh man, this is never going to fly. It's not as loud as anything. It's got too much bottom to be too loud. It's going to make people's speakers distort. It's nothing like anything out there, you know. But it worked, you know.
Was there some quality? Were they like? Was that the guys saying, "Yeah, that's what we want, and it's okay"? I mean, were there people saying,
"No, this is what they wanted. This is definitely what they wanted"? And
so you were insecure about it, but they're like, "No, this is."
Yeah, it's the way I was a little insecure because it's so different from anything I've worked on in years. It was more old school, and I think a lot of it was more of an old school approach with modern equipment. You know, so it's really clean, but it's like the same techniques as years ago.
Go figure. We had a couple questions up here. Yes, sir.
I once heard on Pensato's Place that he was interviewing Howard Benson, and he mentioned the influence of the digital age, quote unquote, and how computers and the internet had affected his entire workflow of engineering. Is that something that you've experienced as well?
Oh, yeah.
Share?
Yeah, first of all, there's almost no physical delivery anymore. Yeah. If someone calls me to do a mix, I get the files through WeTransfer or one of those kind of services, set the mix up, get it to where I like it, send it back, get comments, send another one back, then when we get close, live stream to the producer or artist who's ever in charge, and tweak it up like that, and then send it to mastering. Never even leave the house.
Stay in your jammies.
Coach the singer at all, or
no. There's always a producer to do that. I listened to the singer in the room and then sort of pick what mic I thought would work well, and then maybe try a couple, and usually used. I usually use one of two preamps. I like the Neve Class A preamp that's in the 1073. And sometimes I want to use something like a GML or something that's like really crystal clear and clean, depending on the vocal. And, mics, 67, 47 I've always used. Use a Sony C800G sometimes that I like, AKG C12. Just, sort of get an idea of what's going to sound good on somebody, try a few and record. LA2A usually in the chain. Yeah.
What was the biggest challenge in getting such an organic sound with using like acoustic and electronic outdoor gear, in the box? Like, was there something that you struggled with, or was it just all your experience?
That album, there's nothing that was a struggle on that album. They did most of their electronic and synth stuff to what was recorded acoustically, so it did fit really well. It was, didn't have to fight with much on that.
Yes, sir.
I was on the panel before, on the mastering panel, and we were talking about levels to deliver to mastering engineers. How hot do you print your mixes if you send it to a mastering engineer?
Well, I print a mix that's totally slammed to send to A&R. And then I back it off that the limiter might hit a dB, just catch an occasional peak to send to mastering. I send both mixes to mastering. If the clients reacted very positively to the loud mix, I'll send that to mastering along with the along with the one with no limiting, just, so okay, this is what people like, do something better than this. Pretty much just what Bob and Dylan were talking about.
So when you're pushing the limiter, were you pushing like the mix bus harder to the limiter?
No, just the gain of the limiter up. The gain into the limiter. Yeah. I don't change the mix bus. That's usually pretty much set, and then and I just the limiter I always have set that the ceiling is 1/10 of a dB below digital zero, and then crank the input up that the average level might be between -10 and -8. Depends. Sometimes that works for a song, sometimes it doesn't. So sometimes I'll go -12, have it a little softer and stuff. Just get a good healthy level and a good so there could be a good comparison between that and a commercial release, and then just turn the limiter down pretty much to unity, and it'll catch a peak once in a while, but there's but it'll be 6 to 8 dB lower average level than the limited one, and that's what goes to mastering.
And what limiter is it?
I usually use this plugin, Fab Filter Pro L.
Yes, sir.
Would you suggest to a home studio to people that's getting better at mixing and mastering, but keeps running into a problem having bad performances with artists that aren't ready to record? Is there like a preparation strategy that you give the artists before they come in to make sure that the performance
No, usually artists producers just hire me as an engineer and mixer, and they're good to begin with. Now, when I started out, I didn't start out the way of working at another. I grew up in Rochester, New York, and there were no studios there back then in the 70s, and I started out building a little studio, getting interested in that, and doing demos for local bands, and believe me, I went through trying to get good sounds on bad musicians for a couple years.
Just don't work with bad musicians.
No, actually, it can be an educational experience because you have to really work hard to get a good sound.
Because you wouldn't want to do that your whole life, though.
No. It's dues that need to be paid, though.
When you're mixing, do you monitor RMS levels at all? Or do you just mix to whatever sounds good?
I monitor the levels, but not so much while I'm doing the mix. It's more at the end. Okay, where do I want this to sit? I always mix with the limiter on the mix bus, but not really doing a lot. Just to see how the transients are hitting everything, and then I'll adjust it once I have the balances and stuff. I'll limit it quite a bit to hear. Get the RMS level up, but then hear what it does to the drums and the transients, and then adjust that accordingly to make the mix work at a high level if that's what's needed. If the level needs to be up, like most pop mixes, which is really just the normal way I do it. The Daft Punk was the exception, doing something hi-fi, which was a wonderful experience.
Maybe one last two questions right here.
When you're mixing from home, you said you stream the mix live?
Yeah.
What is there a special software you use for that?
There's a few of them out there. I use something called Nicecast. You can get it online.
Yeah, I'm familiar.
Just go into the computer, digital input, run that out. Over the internet, I have a URL. Just have people log on to that and listen, and communicate on Skype at the same time.
Okay, so they're getting the stream through Nicecast of the audio.
Yeah.
And then you're talking to them on Skype.
Yeah.
That's cool. Yes. Last question here.
What were the records that inspired you to get into music?
Let's see. When I was a kid, I used to love the Young Rascals. Remember that? And of course the Beatles back then too, but the Rascals more. Let's see who else. I was Creedence Clearwater Revival fan, just like the dude. Yeah, I listened to quite a bit of jazz back then too. A lot of those. What was that label? Was it ECM that Rudy Van Gelder done all the recording?
Don't look at me.
No, it wasn't ECM. There was a label, a jazz label, CTI. Yeah. Rudy Van Gelder, who's an excellent engineer, did these incredible jazz recordings. Stuff from Ron Carter was one of the albums I had. There was Hubert Laws had something. And these records are just great music and great engineering from back in the 70s.
Ronan said we could do 2 more questions. So last 2 questions for Mick.
Yeah.
Yes, you.
So do you have, when you get files from your clients and you get like not very stellar sounding takes, what do? Do you send it back and say it needs to be retracked, or do you, or like bad performances, or do you just go ahead and do it anyway because you're getting paid and you're getting hired?
Well, if it's something really bad, I'll call and say, hey, is this supposed to be like this? Is this supposed to suck? Is that what you were going for? Well, I'm a little more diplomatic than that. But that doesn't happen too often anymore. But it still does happen. And depending on the project, sometimes I just try to make the best of it. If there's some bad track or bad sound or bad performances in something that's otherwise good, I'll question it a lot more, saying, hey, this could be really great if we fix this. But usually that doesn't happen very often. It's usually pretty good, or else once in a while it's just all pretty bad. But I just make the best of it. Really, I try not to do the stuff that I don't like. But I usually end up with doing the song, and then I'll try not to do any more.
Last question right there.
How often did you train when you were starting out? Did you practice your craft like hours a day? Or was it...
Oh yeah, when I was starting out back in Rochester, I'd bring one thing. There was actually, aside from bands that were bad, there were some excellent musicians there because the Eastman School of Music, so I get to do lots of nice sessions too. And there were a lot of other people around, bands and stuff who were good, and I just experiment, hours and hours.
Any final words of wisdom for our hungry audience? Guys, can you give it up for Mick Guzauski?
I didn't want to ask the question, and he hasn't.
What's the music that inspires you, wants you to keep working today? Is there something?
Modern music that inspires you today.
Let's see, what is... No, there are. I just can't think of it offhand. Actually, and I'm very guilty of this too, is that since I'm working on music all the time, I don't listen that much, and I should. I'm usually working on pop music, so I'm usually going through the top 10 and seeing how they sound, and say, okay, am I in that ballpark if I'm doing pop records, which is really mostly what I'm doing. But I'm very guilty of not listening to too much now, and
what do you listen to for pleasure?
That's the thing. I watch movies. I haven't listened to much in a while. Just mostly watch movies. But it's not that I don't love music. It's that I'm working on it every day, all day. So.
Thank you, Mick. Thank you, everybody, for good questions. Thank you for hanging out with us today.